If you're familiar with horror media, then you're probably familiar with the concept of the uncanny valley, the disturbing range at which something inhuman looks close enough to resemble one, but something just doesn't feel right. The fact our brain is so honed in on faces like this might imply that there was a point in our evolution where we had to be on the lookout for something that looked human, but wasn't quite. In humanity's early years, fear, anxiety, and paranoia were a necessity for everyday life, staying alongside us for as long as we've been around. And as we've gone on to develop different technologies and get to the top of the food chain, the monsters of the past are no longer the threats they were. Nonetheless, fear and anxiety still stuck around to today, where we can relive the feeling of our primal origins, once again, through the use of horror in media. Horror plays off of this fundamental fear we as humans have had since before we were entirely human, the uncertainty that comes from the imminent approach of a deadly predator. The genre of horror allows us to relive this feeling by creating new threats so that we're no longer at the top of the food chain. And as you can probably guess, there's a lot of variety under the large label of horror, whether it's the many subgenres or the different mediums used to present them. And as the years go by, we've seen many different adaptations of old stories taking new forms. So I decided to take it upon myself to go over each of the main mediums you can go about viewing horror, and seeing how works from each of them take advantage of the medium they're presented in. Not to figure out which is the best, but to highlight their similarities and differences, and why some properties are more easily adapted than others. So it's time to face the abyss head on, and jump into the void as we spiral into horror. Strangely enough, I find music to often be the weakest medium in terms of horror, at least on its own. I find this to be quite surprising, as in visual mediums like movies and games, the score can often add a lot to make a scene more intense. But on its own, you're only left with a piece of sound, and the thoughts and feelings you gather after. But despite these visual limitations, songs can still help you imagine scenery with its tone and instrumentation. Minecraft's Disc 11 is pretty well known for telling a narrative, the story of a player strip mining in a cave deep below ground, before perishing to the mobs found inside it. But there's a much better example of this. An album that can fill the listener with genuine dread as it continues playing. I'm of course talking about Everywhere at the End of Time, created by The Caretaker. Everywhere at the End of Time is more of an audible experience than a regular album, using the deteriorating sounds of static that was once clear music to paint a picture in your mind of a dementia or Alzheimer's patient slowly fading away from consciousness forever. It's designed to give the listener an idea of what it's like to suffer through these conditions, with these brief moments of clarity being quickly subdued with more auditory fog. While things start out with some melancholic, classical music as you reminisce on what your life was, things slowly begin getting worse. The songs start to sound more blaring and repetitive. All the notes start to blend in and feel the same, each song feeling longer than the last. Reverb makes its presence here, blending together the music and making it less coherent. But this is only the beginning. The static in the background acts as your forgetting of memories, its hazy sounds lingering in both the highlights and low points, whether it's softly in the background when you're still lucid, or harshly taking over as your memories cease to exist. Forgetting the faces of those around you, and losing the memories and experiences that make you who you are. And as you continue listening, things slowly decline into nothing more than just empty static and haunting ambience. And with its 6-hour-long runtime, you really get to fall into despair, as the dark thoughts begin to make their appearances. As you listen through this project and desperately try to listen to the music under all that static, you might start to let a terrifying thought seep its way into your mind. My grandparents may be going through this. I may eventually be going through this. And just as all hope seems lost, as the static continues worsening, the clouds begin to clear for just a moment. The music comes back to deliver one of the most blissful finales to any project I've ever experienced. The closest thing I can compare it to is, funnily enough, the music in the Gemini home entertainment videos. You never get to realize how vital the music was in keeping you calm until it's forcibly stripped away from you. And when the music fades back in, the relief is there, but it feels different after viewing the true nature of the video. If you end the album there, you can go about your day pretending like the patient just gets better, but we all know that it isn't meant to last. The static takes over again, and this time, there's no getting out. The horror of Everywhere at the End of Time is intangible. There's no monsters, no boogeymen out to get you. Instead, it's something much more real. Real conditions and mental illnesses. I'm glad the album is getting the recognition that it deserves. Even as meme music, it opens up more avenues for people to learn about the original work. And that's not even mentioning the slew of remixes and original projects inspired by it. I highly recommend everyone watching this video to give it a listen, or at least a wholehearted attempt. It may remind you to cherish your loved ones while they're still around. You really have to give it to the composer, Leyland Kirby, or their alias at the time, The Caretaker, for their amazing work on this dreadful, horrible masterpiece of an album.
I'm sorry to differ with you, sir. But you've always been the caretaker.
But painting a picture in your mind isn't something strictly exclusive to music. Novels do much of the same, allowing the mind to fill in the blanks to create visuals impossible to craft in a studio. Novels are a pretty crazy concept when you think about it. Letters form words, which form sentences, which form paragraphs, which then all come together in chapters to create a narrative. Imagery within books is without hard limits. Grotesque visuals and bad situations are only as realistic and terrifying as the author's vocabulary and reader's understanding can allow for. With that in mind, novels also make an excellent standard for horror, as it's the primary medium where adaptations stem from. The novel version of The Shining is both a ghost story about a hotel with a mind of its own, and a tragedy about abuse, trauma, regret, as well as a family slowly going mad trapped inside the haunted Overlook Hotel. Jack Torrance starts out as a pretty good father, ashamed of his drinking habits and outbursts and wanting to move forward from it. Yet the insanity of the hotel forces him to return to it. And while both the adaptations give the hotel a mind of its own, the book is much more straightforward with it. But regardless of the bad things Jack brought his family through, he was at least able to have somewhat of a redemption by the end of things, snapping out of things for a brief moment before his demise. I want to talk about a book with a less optimistic ending. No Longer Human is the depressing tale of a man who never felt that he fit in. On the outside, he's a cheerful, outgoing guy that makes everyone around him happier, when in reality, he's actually the most miserable. Even putting on a facade to fit in because he fears what might happen if people see him for what he truly is. An outsider who doesn't understand other people and they don't understand him. He's talented in art and gets the attention of every woman around him. And yet, he still feels nothing more than misery, wanting to play the role of a clown and humiliating himself rather than wanting to be respected. The book was written by Shuji Tsushima, more popularly known by his pen name, Osamu Dazai, and published in 1948. It follows the mostly fictional self-insert character Oba Yozo, as he recounts his life story. It's a story of endless tragedy, as all the horrible events, mistakes, and regrets of the man's life begin to pile up and appear in front of him over and over again. The entire time we're waiting for the part where we can finally see the man happy, but it's something that never really happens. Every step forward is compounded with 100 steps back, and in a sense, that makes it all the more real. I'm unsure of how fictional Oba is as a character. While the story's technically fiction, it takes a lot of elements from the real life of Dazai. It's unlikely we'll ever get a clear answer, not from the source at least. Dazai took his own life shortly after the book's completion, and with it being partially autobiographical, it's not much of a stretch to say that it partially functioned as his suicide note. He was 38 years old. But regardless of its dark overtones, No Longer Human is a great novel, but in its greatness, I'd actually also recommend looking at a different version of it. The illustrated manga version by horror icon Junji Ito. While novels are a way to get perfect imaginary visuals, comics and manga give us something to directly look at. This allows for everyone reading to experience the same scares as intended. But this also adds a whole new element of challenge to making horror work. Ito's adaptation of No Longer Human provides definitive visuals to take this depressing horror-adjacent story and rework it into something more horror-defined. Reworking the ending into something different, but in my opinion, a lot more gripping. Including Dazai himself talking with the character he created, inspired by his own experiences. And his visuals make the haunting ghosts of Oba's past a lot more literal. But most of Ito's work doesn't follow this more realistic, psychological form of horror, but instead, he makes horror with disturbing monsters and equally disturbing ideas. A lot of disturbing horror rides on a blurry line between horrifying and hilarious. While one may find this to be the scariest thing they've ever seen, others may just laugh at its absurdity. When it comes to Ito, this definitely changes story to story. I personally find something like Amigara Fault to be existentially terrifying, while Hanging Balloons is a decent concept but often just comes off as goofy. But within these stories, you may begin to notice a pattern with the antagonists. The monsters in these books are usually twisted versions of things you might see in the real world. A couple embracing, snails, babies, music, actresses, holes, planets, even balloons. But one of the most common are various alterations of the human body. Shiver, The Long Dream, Uzumaki, and Amigara Fault are some of the shorts that really spoke to me, all of which playing with ideas that involve the human body impossibly changing in a painful-looking manner. Whether it's cold, breezy holes, having to physically live through an eternity of nightmares, or the contorted shape of a spiral. Seeing these monsters raises a fascinating question. Are you afraid of encountering these things, or becoming one yourself? Twisting into something resembling human, but not quite all the way there. Moving away from the tangible ideas, the Enigma of Amigara Fault, on top of its disgusting body horror, takes advantage of the human feeling of compulsion. The story goes as follows. After an earthquake, these human-shaped holes are opened up in the fault of Amigara Mountain. It's reported on the news, and people begin to head to the mountain in person to see it for themselves. That's when things start to get eerie, as characters begin to see that the holes in the rock are shaped identically to their bodies. Naturally, the people felt compelled to enter the holes, with the logic that the holes must have been tailor-made for them. We learn by the end of the story that these holes were actually used for something much more terrifying. The reason it gets to me is because if I'd been there, I totally would have gone in. It looks pretty cozy after all. But after knowing the true context of what they do to you, the thought of once being intrigued by that now disgusts me. Uzumaki also depicts this more abstract form of horror. One of the opening pages has this image of a bunch of flowers turning into spirals. The idea of real, defined objects turning into the abstract, impossible shape of a spiral is a type of horror that's indescribable. But playing with ideas like this also allows you to summarize it in a way that shines a light on its inherent goofiness. Calling Uzumaki the book where things go spiral scary, isn't an accurate way to describe the story. It's just removing a lot of deserved credit. You could do the same with a lot of Ito's stories. Hanging Balloons, which is the one where a giant version of your head floats and tries to hang you. Or Gyo, which is just gross. The ending of Uzumaki and the entirety of Ramina is cosmic horror, featuring events much bigger than our characters can deal with. I've seen a lot of people upset about Uzumaki's ending. with the two protagonists just giving up and accepting their fate together in the spiral. But personally, I think it's the only ending that actually makes sense. When watching horror, it's easy to imagine yourself in the same situation and how to get out of it. Just don't go to the haunted cabin. Just don't do the ritual. Don't be stupid. But with Uzumaki and Ramina, the best the characters can do is fight back for as long as they can. Because of the established rules set up in the world, it wouldn't make sense for a grand escape. They couldn't leave, so why force in a happy ending? In many ways, an ending that aligns with expectations subverts the subversion of expectations. The outcome of an encounter always stays realistic. There's never an ending that seems like the story is trying to force a happy conclusion, made evident by the fact that some stories just have characters needlessly suffering. Sometimes, a main character can just get away alive, as a lot of the time, the characters aren't so lucky. Ito's art style is purposely simple. Characters have minimal shading and colors are rarely ever present. This contrasts heavily when we get to see a monster, with the amount of detail helping to make the monsters appear more out of this world. But the true genius of Junji Ito's work isn't the twisted ideas, compelling stories, or even the artwork, but the way it uses a book's most fundamental concept against you, the page turn. To illustrate this for those who haven't read Uzumaki, allow me to show the first true scare of the book. For some light context, the father of one of our main characters has been getting increasingly obsessed with the concept of a spiral. He hasn't been allowing anyone to enter his study for quite a while. A character and his mother look for him in his study, where this circular container is found. As they look inside, their horrified reaction is shown. Suspense builds up. Then we get a highly detailed full-page spread of the father contorted into a twisted spiral. The whole scene is to build anticipation and raise suspense. Then by the end of the page, you have to choose to see it for yourself, adding that slight bit of interactivity so that you can feel the same shock the characters are one page earlier. I get a similar feeling when opening doors in a horror game. You never really know what exactly is hiding on the other side. Junji Ito can play off of things in a way that just doesn't work in any other medium. Case in point, the anime adaptation. Ito has a reputation for being able to make things scary with one detailed image, something he can do because of his attention to detail. Images with so much stuff going on are only really feasibly possible within the realm of manga, as while animation hypothetically has more possibilities, like being able to depict movement and having sound, an issue quickly pops up regarding the time and budget. When looking at such detailed illustrations, you get a close look at just how much work goes into one detailed panel, and that work absolutely pays off. But when you have to worry about how to go about drawing that image over and over again, you have to start cutting back. Details are lost and movement becomes stilted. But there's a way to get most of the advantages of animation without animating everything. And that's by paying actors and doing it in live action. At last, we've finally made it to the medium of film. The fact you have to show something to the viewer and make them believe it's really there can make a film the most difficult medium yet. The filmmaker has to balance keeping the audience's fear of the unknown with the satisfaction of actually seeing and hearing the horrors. Film is a visual medium. Visual effects need to be enough to align with or surpass the audience's expectations, which isn't an easy task. At least with comics, you can get away with absurd ideas so long as the reader doesn't have to see how they move or sound in real time. Getting special effects wrong could make an attempt at horror laughably bad and break the immersion, killing all tension completely. And the exact same thing also goes for sound design. It's pretty hard to take something seriously if it's using royalty-free sound effects. But instead of satisfying the audience's curiosity, you could always go the exact opposite route, and just leave the horrors to the audience's imagination. But if there's too much empty nothing in your film, it can become boring, or unsatisfying to your audience. Remember when I mentioned The Shining as an example of a great horror novel? Well, as an adaptation, the Stanley Kubrick movie is pretty bad, actually. The adaptation prioritizes making itself work specifically as a great film, rather than as an accurate adaptation. It takes great risks with its changes, but that makes it a much better film because of it. A direct adaptation of a book's material usually doesn't work as well as a feature film. Books are between 50 and 100,000 words long, while movie scripts are only about 7,500 to 20,000. Scripts don't have the space for inserting the fine details. That's where the visuals have to step up to the plate. A film's aesthetic plays a great role in building a story's tone, and when it comes to horror, that tone has to remain uncomfortable. The film uses abrupt, empty black screens with no music and simple, undetailed fonts for title cards, with the absence of everything leaving an uncomfortable feeling. Then it uses these ominous blaring synths as they're driving towards the hotel, like an emergency warning before an incoming storm. Then the camera work within the hotel consists mainly of wide shots, demonstrating the scale of the building while also highlighting the uncomfortability of the empty space. The medium of film allows for audio to enhance the immersion as well, something that isn't directly possible in books, unless it's a description of sound. Music choice is very important when it comes to how audiences react. Music seems to have a lot of power over how we feel, and it tells us a lot about what the creator wants us to feel. But music isn't the only thing sound has to offer. Sound design is just as important as music choice, specifically for immersion and accuracy. This brings us to my favorite scene of the movie, and it's also the first pretty big scare. While the Outlook Hotel is supposed to be empty for the winter, Danny's passing the time by riding around the hotel's various halls on his trike. He's done it a few times before, so it's something we're pretty used to by now. We get a nice, long shot of it, followed by the camera enthusiastically following Danny. Then, when he turns the corner, two girls are in front of him. While they were shown a few times earlier in the film, I don't think anyone was specifically expecting it. It's a solid scare without any cheap jump scares or loud noises, but seeing something you aren't expecting. And in my opinion, that's a whole lot scarier than something you could see coming from a mile away. There's a bit of a sting, but it isn't loud enough to send you flying out of your seat, and it happens before he finishes turning the corner. It's a great moment, especially as the scene takes us through a whole slew of emotions afterwards, from mildly uncomfortable, to startled, to anticipation, to ease. All of this without needing to exchange dialogue. Only having the two girls talking to Danny in unison, telling him to play with them. It presents itself in a way that can't be done in any other medium, even in a comic, where the sudden scare could feasibly work with a page turn. But even then, it would still be missing the audio aspects, and would be an overall less enticing scene. But this isn't the only fantastic scene in the movie. Much later, we have Wendy checking up on her husband as paranoia increases. But her husband isn't in the study writing where he usually is. Then, she checks what he's been working on all this time, only for it to be pages on top of pages of paper with the same phrase. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Over and over again, page after page, revealing that Jack's lost it a long time ago. Again, I couldn't imagine this scene being better written out on a page, especially with Jack's mental breakdown that takes place right after. The acting ability shown here by Jack Nicholson and the sheer terror of Shelley Duvall could barely be matched with my imagination. And in the confines of a written page, his screen presence wouldn't have been there otherwise. The way he cycles through emotions in this movie so naturally couldn't be matched in the same way with text on a page. Not to mention all the camera work and long shots you'd be missing out on. How it follows the axe as Jack swings it against the door, or the iconic shot of him after breaking down the door, or the blood elevator, or the bar. Things that have been referenced in tons of other creative works, but the insanity in some of these scenes may not entirely be acting. This film is pretty infamous for Stanley Kubrick, the director of the film,
making the lead actors retake shots hundreds of times.
And after repeating the same thing over and over again too many times, it isn't too surprising that the acting resulted in insanity. Much like Amigara Fault, the horror of The Shining isn't just the isolation of the hotel, or even the psychic powers of The Shining itself, but instead, the fear of compulsion. Losing control and intentionally doing something you'd normally find heinous is what really does it for me. That, and the fact that the heinous thing is Jack murdering his own family, raising the uncomfortability tenfold, as Jack slowly becomes more and more openly abusive to those that love him the most. But imagining yourself in Jack's position, there's really no way around the inevitable outcome. The hotel's slowly making Jack lose his mind, more than he already has. And it's established that the last guy did the same thing. At its launch, Stephen King really didn't like the direction the film took compared to the book, saying that the tone was too cold, and the story stopped being a tragedy. 17 years later, Stephen King and Mick Garris got together to make a more accurate adaptation of the book, in the form of a 3-part TV movie. And while they succeeded with their goal of accuracy, it suffers as a film because of it. Much like the Junji Ito anime adaptations, the film falls too closely in line with the book. The reason fans continue to debate on which version of The Shining is better is specifically because of the changes Kubrick made to the source material. The 1997 version is just a watered-down version of the book with some bad CGI effects. And maybe it's just me, but the washed-out color composition makes the 1997 version look older than the one from 1980, which is weird, because the 1997 TV movie also had a higher budget than the one shown in cinemas 17 years earlier. But what about a different type of horror film? The Thing. While The Shining and The Thing both fall under the vague genre of horror, they each take very different approaches with how the scares are delivered. And they're also adapted from different sources, one from a novel, the other from a movie inspired by a novel. They both play around with isolation, but the means of which are very different. The Thing is an adaptation of the 1951 film The Thing from Another World, which itself was inspired by a 1938 novel titled Who Goes There? It takes place in an Antarctic research lab, completely cut off from the outside world after their means of communication are cut. The fear here comes from paranoia, as it's impossible to tell the difference between a human or a fake alien imposter, slowly assimilating with the living things around it. At any given moment, there could be one or more of these things running around at once. Figuring out who is or isn't real at any point in time is what gives the movie its character. That paired with the constant accusing between people, creating strife between characters. The only reason Mac takes charge as leader is because he's the most bold and paranoid of them all. Something interesting with how The Thing was adapted, it's more so loosely based off of The Thing from Another World, as the 1950s movie has a lot of differences between the one almost 30 years later. Something The Thing executes perfectly is its special effects. To capture the body horror the film needed to work, there was a lot of effort put into making special effects that look real and actually function. All imperfections are hidden in the shadows. And the film does a very, very good job at hiding them. Much like the works of Junji Ito, The Thing is a more primal depiction of horror. The idea that humans are no longer at the top of the food chain, so we have to fight to maintain our survival. The Thing is an alien from space. It has no concept of human morals. It's merely a predator hunting prey. And because it can't understand us, it can't be controlled or reasoned with. But speaking of control, I think it's time to enter our final category. I feel like video games have the most potential in terms of horror, but that potential has been realized the least. Of course, some games work better than others. Most of the indie horror games you can find on itch.io take this linear approach, where there's rarely any variety between experiences, acting like a playable movie. With games like PT, the appeal is the items in your environment changing around you, just like I'm on observation duty, where this subtle existential dread fades in as more and more items around you have moved, appeared, or vanished without you noticing. It's a kind of game that only really works as a playable experience, so you can watch the world change around you, not your main character. But with something like Slender Man, the concept is a lot more open-ended. It didn't even start as a game. being an adaptation of a creepypasta stemming from a post on Something Awful. Notice that you can make Slender Man into a movie. I didn't say it was a good movie, but the fact it got one in the first place is enough to prove my point. But going backwards from that, Saw the Game and Alien Isolation both take similar approaches with their adaptation, with them not choosing to remake the properties, but to add new stories to the worlds they occupy. And while reviews for Saw the Game are a little mixed, Alien Isolation is still seen as a great horror game to this day, with it capturing the helpless feeling Ripley gives off in the movie. It seems the people behind these games are already familiar with the challenges of directly remaking an existing work, so they sidestep it completely by making something new. Generally, the horror I get from games has to do with how they force you into these awful situations, and that you have no choice but to power through it. Survival horror games get especially bad once you're given a gun, since you know that you'll have to use it. It doesn't help that games are an interactive medium. You can't put it on in the background. You have to stay conscious and focused. And most horror games include a lot of quiet audio signals, but differentiating between helpful cues and ambient sounds only happens once you know what the sound means. So as established, video games have the most variety in what you can experience. They have cutscenes like a film, background music, sound effects, and even added interactivity. Iron Lung is a horror game that goes against all of that. I feel like most would agree that games are more fun when they're more responsive. The more natural the controls are, the more immersed you are in the world around you. Iron Lung is immersive, but instead of allowing you to control it with ease, instead it traps you in this shoddy submarine at the bottom of a blood ocean, and it forces you to align your coordinates to a map in order to navigate, with the only source of outside feedback being the proximity sensors on your ship and the camera used to acquire any evidence of life. The game doesn't even show your position, yet it all works, amazingly. Controlling the sub is clunky and jagged, but that just makes things more immersive. You aren't playing as the submarine, or as an experienced captain, you're a convict thrown in there on a suicide mission, and the game reminds you of that every step of the way. With your eyes and movements severely limited, the game can take full advantage of your lack of direct sight. The sound design plays a major role in keeping you on edge, with every bit of clanking, ambience, or creature noises amping up your anxiety. Even if you hear something directly in front of you, the amount of time it takes to run to the back of the ship, hit the camera button, and wait for the picture to load, whatever was there has already left, leaving the paranoia to keep building up. Things only get worse as you progress through the game. The oxygen meter in your ship is tied to crossing world barriers, and as the oxygen depletes, the systems around you begin to fail. These failed systems are purely visual and don't affect the gameplay, but the player doesn't know that until a repeat playthrough, or until they wait around long enough to find out. The backstory for the game is also very compelling. Every known celestial body carrying life in the universe vanished at once in what became known as the Quiet Rapture, and much like Ramina, the prospect of giant planets just vanishing is a cosmically large horror story. On April 21st of 2023, Markiplier released the teaser trailer for his own film adaptation of Iron Lung, with direct involvement of the creator. I'm interested to see how the film goes about making a game with the only input being indirect control, and managing to strip the one source of player feedback away from it, leaving only the acting and the audio. It appears we've gone full circle. Making this video gave me a whole new sense of appreciation towards all the mediums involved, and gave me a wider view of art as a whole. Horror used to be my least favorite genre. Why would people go out of their way to want to feel uncomfortable? I get it now. It's a genre that can work wonderfully in any type of medium, whether it's used in more of a psychological, disturbing, or threatening way. And most of the time, it gives off the most genuine feelings out of any form of art. Horror speaks to us in a way other genres just don't. It can leave us thinking about it for a long time after first experiencing it, and it raises some of the most interesting ideas you could find in stories. Different mediums work in different ways, and there's a lot of fun to be had in seeing what those different ways are. In many ways, horror is the rawest form of emotion, While its uncomfortability has followed us since the caveman days, it also serves as a way of connecting us. Bonding over the things that scare us is one of the most human experiences we can achieve. At least, I hope it's human. As without your humanity, you may not be feeling the senses of horror.